In the wake of New York's Election Day upset in 2022, Democrats were left grappling with a laundry list of reasons for their dismal performance. From a failed redistricting plan to lackluster campaign coordination, the party found itself in disarray as Republicans swept House seats in one of the bluest states in the nation. The GOP won all 4 races on Long Island, including the race between DC seat chair Son Patrick Maloney versus State Assemblyman Mike Lawler in New York's 17th Congressional District. The blame game was in full swing, with fingers pointing at everyone, from Governor Kathy Hochul to State Democratic Committee Chair Jay Jacobs. Hochul's narrow victory and alleged lack of support for fellow Democrats drew sharp criticism, while Jacobs defended the party's efforts, insisting they did their best with what they had. But perhaps the biggest blow came from the courts, which overturned the Democrats' aggressive redistricting map, paving the way for Republicans to claim victory in key battlegrounds. As the dust settled, Democrats were left soul-searching and searching for answers in the aftermath of a political earthquake that shook the Empire State to its core. Then came a glimmer of hope with former Representative Tom Suozzi's win in the special election to fill ex-Representative George Santos's House seat. Suozzi defeated Republican Nassau County legislator Mazi Pilip in a comfortable victory that returned him to his old seat representing New York's 3rd Congressional District, which voted for President Biden in 2020 by 8 points. Today, we're diving deep into the ever-shaping landscape of New York State politics, where the recent approval of new congressional maps has sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. After years of deliberation, New York State Legislature has finally given the green light to a fresh set of district lines. But what does this mean for the future of the Empire State's political arena? Strap in because we're about to find out. These lines aren't just ink on paper, they're battlegrounds, shaping the outcome of key House races that could tip the balance of power come this November. And while some hail this as a victory for bipartisanship, others see it as a missed opportunity for a Democratic gerrymander. But amidst the political drama, a new generation is rising to the challenge. With a staggering 41 million Gen Zers eligible to vote this year, 2024, the political landscape is undergoing a seismic shift. These young trailblazers aren't just spectators. They're demanding a seat at the table. And speaking of trailblazers, our guest today embodies the spirit of this new wave of political activism. Skyler Johnson, a force to be reckoned with in New York State politics, ran for state senate in 2020. Skyler's campaign wasn't just about politics, it was about amplifying the voices of the marginalized and fighting for the working class. And now he's back. This is episode 128 of the Political Mike podcast. Mr. Johnson, thank you so much for being a part of the Political Mike today.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Very excited to be here.
Why are you running? What are the issues that are facing your district? And what caused you to say, this is my time to put my hat into the arena?
Absolutely. So that's a great opening question. So as you know, I'm running for New York State Assembly District 4, which actually was a Democratic held seat for 30 years. The chair of New York's Environmental Conservation Committee, Steve Engelbright, held this seat between the years of 1992 and 2022. And unfortunately, he lost by just under 700 votes in Long Island's 2022 red wave. He was defeated by an incumbent who ran on, by a now incumbent, I should say, who ran on issues such as Hunter Biden's laptop and on defunding public education. Meanwhile, he now represents Stony Brook University, one of the largest state schools within New York. So it was an absolute devastating loss for Long Island and for New York as a whole. So as you know, I've run for office a couple of times before. When I was 19 years old, I threw my hat into a primary for state senate. For state senate, and I managed to get 3,000 votes in that primary, and in 2022 I came back as the state senate Democratic nominee, unfortunately again succumbing to the same red wave that defeated Steve Engelbright, that took down other incumbents, and that made it very hard for us to pick up any seats in 2022, but I still managed to be one of the top performing Democrats on Long Island in that period of time down ballot. So now this year, I wasn't originally planning on running again for anything at this point. I wasn't sure that this was going to be something that I was going to do in the meantime. I had other projects to work on, and I was excited to be able to help however I could. But watching Engelbright go down was incredibly devastating. And that defeat took a little bit for us to find out about. We're going into the next few weeks because of absentee ballots, because of the close margin. We weren't initially sure if Engelbright had actually lost or not. And after it became clear that he had lost, I had people reach out to me and say, hey, of course, we're still a couple of years away from this, but you should consider running for this seat. And I thought about it and decided that that was a good path because I knew that I had the political knowledge as well as experiences that would lend me to be a good voice within the state legislature. You know, I'm a Planned Parenthood I'm a member of my local Planned Parenthood Hudson, which is Planned Parenthood Hudson Peconic Action Fund. I'm the chair of the Suffolk County Young Democrats. I'm a nonprofit worker focusing on reducing overdose deaths, and I've spent many, many hours in the halls of the state capitol advocating for issues that matter to the average person. So I believe that there's a lot that I can lend to this district that the incumbent has failed to do.
As someone deeply involved in state politics, how do you perceive the bipartisan support, or lack thereof, for the new maps? Do you believe this reflects a genuine effort to improve the electoral process, or are there underlying political motivations at play?
Well, I know that New York State Democrats were a little bit nervous to be aggressive with the new maps after the 2022 debacle because people around the country were watching that happen and were shocked about the courts overturning our maps. We're dismayed at what it meant for the House of Representatives, but being in that process was remarkable because it was an incredibly tumultuous time. It was incredible. It was an incredibly unclear time about what was going to happen next. What has to be understood nationwide is that while everyone was studying the maps from an analytical standpoint, candidates had no idea what to do because all of a sudden people who had been running in Biden +6 districts had been drawn into Trump +20 districts. People who had been running to represent their own neighborhoods in which they'd grown up in now all of a sudden found that their districts stretched 30 miles away from where they've ever stepped foot and that their own home neighborhoods were no longer being represented by that member. So it created this remarkably poor scenario where we spent months unsure where our candidates were even running, often facing primaries while the Republican Party had already locked down all their nominees, putting us at a steep disadvantage. So I know that the New York State Legislature was very eager to not have that process repeated. If you had put me in charge of drawing the maps, there are a lot of changes that I would have made. I will be clear about that. I think that unfortunately these maps failed to create some opportunity minority districts that should have been created. However, I am happy that we have passed into law maps that are not an aggressive gerrymander, that give both parties reasonable chance to flip several districts while also undo the gerrymandering that the Republican Party committed when they controlled the state Senate for almost 80 years. So I'm glad that we are finally starting to see fair maps in New York because the Republican Party just very quick New York history. While New York has always been seen as one of the bluest states in the nation, our upper chamber of the state legislature was controlled by Republicans between the 1940s and 2018. So the Republicans had, by the admission of the courts, committed severe malapportionment in order to try to retain their Senate majority and protect their congressional delegation. So we are now finally taking steps to undo the damage that they did when they held the majority for decades.
In light of the criticisms and challenges faced by the Democratic Party in New York, what strategies do you think, Mr. Johnson, are essential for rebuilding trust and engagement among voters, especially those from marginalized communities?
That's a great question, and I think where it really starts is actually embracing our own messaging. I unfortunately live right in the middle of what was now the infamous Lee Zeldin's congressional district. Many people were introduced to Lee Zeldin when he first stepped up to run for governor of New York, but I've been dealing with that guy for the last 10 years or so. And we don't get along. We don't get along very well. I'll be honest, I was once handing out pamphlets at a street fair and he looked me in the eye and then crossed the street so that way he wouldn't have to walk by me. And I can tell you that from dealing with Lee Zeldin on a one-on-one level, that trying to embrace or pander to his messaging will always fail. And that's unfortunately what we tended to do in 2022, where instead of actively fighting back along his messaging, which was racist and a lie, we tended to downplay the achievements that New York Democrats had created over the last several years, and we went onto the defensive at all measures, which meant that we constantly embraced, as I said, Republican talking points about everything from criminal justice to housing and the economy, and I think that it killed us in the end. Because as I spoke to voters, and I spoke to thousands of voters throughout 2022, remember, I was on the ticket as well, I spent much of my time defending the governor because we often found that people had no idea about the accomplishments of the New York State Democrats. They had been given completely incorrect information. They had been lied to repeatedly, and they had basically been told that the New York State Democratic Party had abandoned them. And I don't believe that we did a very good job at going on the offense and showing them what we'd done and what Republican rule of New York would actually mean for them. So I believe that as we are approaching this election year, we need to make sure that we are making it clear that the MAGA agenda is not good for New York, that trying to reduce funding to public education is bad for New York, that cutting health services is bad for New York, and that taking drastic steps that end any kind of actual serious criminal justice policy will just lead to an increase in crime. There is so much that we can do in New York, and minority communities have been, listen, Long Island is one of the most segregated places in the country. We unfortunately have a very long and very interesting history of racial relations here in the island, where one of our towns, for example, has been famous for a long time for previously having a measure in its charter that only allowed the sale of homes to Caucasian individuals. We have a famed Nazi training camp about 20 minutes from where I grew up, and the KKK was very active on the island. We have a long and very poor racial history here on the island, but so addressing that head on is the way to go. Acknowledging the fact that we are now one of the fastest growing communities in the nation, that we are a rapidly diversifying community, and that making sure that we are addressing the cost of housing, addressing the lack of public transportation, addressing all of these disparities here in Suffolk County as well as in Nassau County. That is the only way forward if we are actually going to tell minority voters that we are there for them, and also turn out our base to make sure that we are able to retain control of the New York State government, regain control of the House of Representatives, and pass policies that work for the everyday person.
I alluded to it at the beginning of the show. 41 million eligible Gen Z voters. That's how many Gen Z folks are going to be eligible to vote this year. 41 million. There's a question that the Democratic Party has been grappling with, and it is, how do we get Gen Z to believe that we're on their side, that we're championing the issues that are important to them? There's been a lot of talk about student loans. There's been a lot of talk about a ceasefire. Representative Maxwell Frost, the first Gen Z member of Congress, recently said in the aftermath of President Biden's State of the Union that there's no silver bullet to attracting Gen Z votes. In your view, what should the Democratic Party be doing that it is currently not doing to get Gen Z voters and to ensure that they're signaling to them that they're not taking them for granted, that they're not ignoring them, that they're not giving them temporary policy proposals just to get them to the polls, only to get their votes this election, and then they're going to ignore them after the election? What should they do?
So, and I think Congressman Frost is right. If there was one answer to this question, if there was a simple answer to this question, I would have been in office a long time ago, and we would hold basically all the seats here on the island. I'm running to represent, like I said, the district that encompasses Stony Brook University, which has thousands upon thousands of eligible voters, almost all of whom are Democrats. The issue is that we have not done a great job as a party of investing time and energy into doing outreach on those campuses. Often those campuses, college campuses, end up end up in some sort of bubble. They end up being very hard to penetrate. They end up being very hard to reach their students. Their students are often completely separated from our other means of messaging that is going on everywhere else around them. So first of all, making sure that we are actually spending time speaking to people on college campuses across the state of New York and across this country are going to be incredibly necessary if we want to win young votes. But this has to also this has to be more than just a policy, an approach of political tactics. In blue states like New York, and regardless of what some other people say, New York is still a deep blue state. We may have had some issue on a congressional level, but we have super majorities in both chamber of the state legislature currently. We have the ability to pass some serious policy. It's time that we actually implement civics classes into our high school, because the biggest challenge to turning out students to vote is not apathy. It's not apathy. It's the fact that they have never been taught about what these different aspects of government actually mean. It would be significantly easier to get students to turn out to vote if they understood, and to get young people as a whole to turn out to vote if they understood that that the important part wasn't just voting for Joe Biden in November. If they understood that there's people running for their state legislatures, running for their county legislatures, running for town council, running for seats that can directly impact their lives on incredibly large levels. But because our schools unfortunately do not prioritize civic education, it is very hard to first explain to students what the different mechanisms and functions of government actually are, and then convince them why it matters for them to come out to vote. But embracing policy that young people care about, as you said, student loans, talking about the cost of housing, showing young people that we actually understand the plight that is facing, that they are facing, and putting forward solutions to address that. It's the only way forward. Because, and I'm going to be completely honest here, people our age were very explicitly told that the world worked in a certain way, that if you, got good grades, you went to a good school, you got into a good college, that you could get a good job, and that's all that you needed, for the white picket fence and the 2.5 kids. And then they graduate. And I could say that for me, my people in my age range, and I'm sure in your age range, I think we're around the same age, grew up, grew up in the middle of the Great Recession. They grew up watching as friends or potentially their own families had their homes seized, as businesses closed, as the world seemed to be falling into a state of hopelessness. And then as we got older, unfortunately, while we did see that economic recovery, it became very clear as we entered adulthood that kind of housing market that our parents had seen had disappeared. That wages had stagnated when compared to inflation. That American dream was out of reach for the majority of our generation. And so I believe that if the Democratic Party is able to demonstrate that they understand that and have a path to actually move forward to restore the ability for those for young people to live lives and not be running at the risk of having to work until they're 95 just to rent, a 1-bedroom apartment, I think that is the only way to capture the youth vote once more.
The recent surge in young people showing interest in running for office is remarkable, but there seems to be a gap between interest and actual candidacy. What do you believe are the most significant barriers preventing young people from ultimately deciding to make that next step and run for political office? And how can these barriers be effectively addressed in your view?
I'm very happy for the support that I've received from my local Democratic Party, as I've run this year. I've received endorsements from currently 4 members of the Assembly, from the state comptroller, multiple members of the local county legislature, other local elected officials, as well as currently one union and the New York Working Families Party. But it took me a really long time to get here. And I understand that. I understand that to a large extent. I understand the skepticism around young people running. But I will say that when I first stepped into this ring and said, hey, I want to run for office, there were some people that said, okay, great, we are not sure if you're going to win, but let's at least uplift you to make sure that you stay in this. There were other people who outright mocked me for that sentiment. And I think that that's unfortunately been the experience for a lot of young people trying to run, is that they're treated with some form of suspicion and hostility instead of brought up as leaders. Even if they're not running for the race that you want them to run for, just make sure that they know that you are behind them in one way or another. So that way, when they continue to run, when they continue to get involved in campaigns, they know that they're going to be supported. And I mean, I think that there's other practical issues that come along with running when you're a young person, largely fundraising. Any good fundraising or political consultant will tell you that when you first decide to run for office, you should go through everybody that you know and call them and ask them for money. And the problem is that when you're a young person, you're unlikely to have a list of people who can greatly fund your campaign compared to someone who may be 2 or 3 times your age. So that is one of the key issues. New York, thankfully, has helped to start to address that. We have a new program called Public Financing of Elections, where when someone in your district donates up to $250, you receive a match of 12-1 by the state of New York. So that is very great for young people who are looking to run for office for the first time. But I think that the biggest thing is just making sure that young people are treated as equal parts of the political process. It is acknowledged that even though they may not have the same level of experience as someone, their senior, that they are a valid member of their community who is looking to make change, and then helping them to get involved in ways that are productive to allow them to run for office. But if young people are treated as knowing nothing when they first try to step into the political ring and are basically told you're never going to make it, then they're never going to make it. They're going to walk away before they have a chance. So I think that doing what we can to uplift young candidates, even if that doesn't mean supporting them for every race, but just letting them know that they are viewed as a future leader in the party, is critical if we want to get more young people to actually run for office and to get involved in other ways.
I've been hearing since 2016 a lot of cynicism, a lot of complaining about the 2 leading candidates of the respective 2 dominant parties in America's political system. 2020 was no different. And now here we are in 2024 with the rematch between President Joe Biden, former President Donald Trump. The first time 2 presidents are going head-to-head against each other with presidential records since 1892. For the cynic out there who says, I voted for Joe Biden, I don't see much that my vote has done to change my current lot in life, to change my community, to change the status quo. What is your message to them? How would you show them the receipts, so to speak, of what the Biden administration has produced? And I say this in light of the fact that I've always said on this platform, President Joe Biden has accomplished more legislatively than any other American president in the 21st century. You have to compare his record to that of Lyndon B. Johnson. I've had conservatives on the platform say the exact same thing. Now, the first major offshore wind project in the United States has completed construction and it's delivering power to New York. This is a major achievement for an industry that's faced turbulence over the past year. The offshore wind portfolios of northeastern states, which underpin President Biden's climate goals and his target for the industry, have suffered several cancellations. This is just one of the many things that his climate agenda is showing that it's having tangible, concrete impacts on folks' lives. What would you point to for the cynic out there who says, what has Biden really done?
Well, listen, Joe Biden is not perfect, but I always like to remind people that Joe Biden inherited a country in a complete state of crisis. That if the RNC has quiet admissions out there about what it was like under Donald Trump, because whenever they try to point to numbers, for some reason they always stop at 2019. And I always think that it's interesting because they'll say, well, here's how things looked in 2020, weren't they terrible? And you have to go and go, hey, who was president for the entirety of the year 2020? Since Joe Biden was elected, violent crime is down. We are seeing an economy growing at a rapidly strong level, even though the Republican Party has gone out of their way to spread misinformation about that. We see record unemployment, but when you're saying to me, what would you point to? I could literally point to, just on Long Island right here, all of our infrastructure projects that are underway. Our schools received historic funding because that came from the American Rescue Plan. It came from Joe Biden's federal dollars. New York has actually received a lot, which is not common for New York, by the way, which tends to be a state that puts significantly more into the federal system than we get back. But under Joe Biden, we have actually seen where I can tell you that the highway, and I'm pointing as if you could see it, but the highway near my house is currently under repair, and that is coming from federal infrastructure dollars that New York State received. We are currently dealing with a situation right now where we're fighting to make sure that our school funding stays on the same level. But the only reason it even increased to the level that it was, and I'm going to help to make sure that it stays at that level, is because, as I said before, Joe Biden delivered dollars for education to the state of New York. So we have seen very tangible outcomes. And I could talk about more. I could talk about the fact that we passed one of the largest climate packages in history. I could talk about capping insulin at $35 a month for Medicaid. I can talk about the fact that that Joe Biden has canceled a historic amount of student loans, even with the Supreme Court's blocking of the main student loan reform. Millions of Americans have now seen relief from their student loans, including members of my family who had been stuck paying them for over 20 years, woke up to find their student loans wiped out, which completely altered their lives. There are so many tangible examples, but you can quite literally say that you can look outside your door and point to the fact that we are seeing infrastructure repair that New York State has not been able to make in previous years because we are now receiving the federal dollars to make these repairs. So I think there is a lot that you could point to under Joe Biden, and I believe that if and I think it's also very clear that if we had a House of Representatives currently that had any ability to function whatsoever, and I'm not even just talking about their policy, just if they had any ability to function on a procedural level, we would have seen a lot more. But under even just the first 2 years of the Biden administration, we saw some historic change, and I do believe that if we're able to reelect President Biden, that we're able to make sure that we hold the Senate and retake the House of Representatives, that we can see 4 years of continued progress because we have an administration in Washington that knows what they're doing as opposed to one who just wants to send the nation into chaos.
Your governor, Kathy Hochul, she's been fielding criticism on her left and right flanks. She has been viewed as too soft on crime and been portrayed as too soft on crime, which is a historically typical line that Republicans usually take against Democratic governors of large metropolitan cities like New York. And on the left side, left-leaning Democrats have called her plan to increase passenger bag checks and overreach. What is your view about the crime rate in New York under the governor's tenure so far? Now, she came in following Andrew Cuomo, swirling controversies and scandals around him, and she has quite been making the name for herself, I think. Possibly a really strong contender in 2028, in my view.
So let me tell you something about myself that I didn't mention before. So before I began work as the director of development for my nonprofit focusing on reducing overdose deaths in the United States, I worked for a local nonprofit that partnered with the Sheriff of Suffolk County, where I live, and as well as law enforcement agencies throughout the state of New York to reduce recidivism rates. And that was by giving those who were leaving incarceration and who were currently incarcerated the resources resources that they needed to not recidivate. It meant getting them access to housing. It meant getting them access to resume support, to job training. We partnered with the Department of Labor to actually get them job placements. And through that program, the larger program for Suffolk County is called the Sheriff's Transition and Reentry Team, and it was created by the currently Democratic Sheriff of Suffolk County in order to reduce recidivism, and has done so by about 30% here in Suffolk County. That was not done by sending more police officers into Black communities. That program was not done by saying we need to arrest as many people as possible. That program was done by recognizing that there was a root issue that caused crime and saying, how do we address this? And so here's the thing. When we were talking about crime in the state of New York, first of all, there has been plenty of studies that have shown that over the last couple of years, crime in New York did not increase. Coverage of crime increased in the state of New York. The news started reporting on crime far more than they did in previous years. So that is one thing to note. But I think that it is very clear that passing social programs, that increasing access to resources is the only way to go if we want to reduce crime within the state of New York. I believe that unfortunately, we have a knee-jerk reaction of just trying to arrest more people anytime we see any increase in crime, and that will never work because you're not addressing any of the systemic issues of why crime occurs. You know, if you want to. Something that anyone watching from New York knows is that the issue of the time for the last 4 years has been bail reform, where New York eliminated cashless bail eliminated cash bail for certain crimes. All that means is that if you're arrested for certain crimes, you will be released for pre-trial without having to pay bail. Now, if bail was still in place, if you were arrested for that crime and could afford to pay the cost of bail, you would still be released pre-trial. All that they did was remove that financial inequity. However, and listen, there's problems with that bill. There's problems with every bill, and I'm happy to help to fix the problems with that bill. But I have an opponent that stubs his toe and says that bail reform did it. The Republican Party has actually sent out mailers saying bail reform is at fault for this murder because this guy paid $10,000 in bail and then went and killed someone. Well, if he paid $10,000 in bail, then he did not benefit from bail reform. That is the opposite of what bail reform is. They directly actually lied to voters in order to try to increase the crime statistics. So instead of yelling the line tough on crime, we need to actually address the root causes of crime. And I have experience doing that. I have experience helping to create programs that address the systemic roots of crime and actually reduce them. And if I'm in the state legislature, I believe that I can take steps to help to implement more criminal justice policies that keep people from committing crimes, that keep people from going back to jail, that get people into productive jobs and work placements that will keep New Yorkers safe. I will always prioritize public safety, and we can do so knowing the fact that we actually have the data that shows how to properly address the causes of crime and how to end much violent crime in the state of New York.
The recent deployment of the National Guard to combat crime in New York City subways has sparked controversy. How do you assess Governor Hochul's decision to utilize this measure specifically, considering the criticism from left-leaning Democrats who view it as an overreach and Republicans who argue it's an inadequate response to a rising crime situation?
Well, here's the thing that I will say. From the moment that Governor Hochul got elected, she has never had a moment that wasn't under some form of controversy. Much of it wasn't her own. So I love that you say, she might be a contender in 2028. I think she would shake her head violently if you said that. I was at an event with her, and she said, "This is the highest office I've held. This is the highest office I ever intend to hold." And I will tell you that a fun fact about Governor Hochul's ascension to governor is that she found out that she was going to be governor with everybody else in the state of New York. Governor Cuomo didn't tell her that he was resigning. She was in a diner and watching the news, and Governor Hochul came on the TV and said, "In 2 weeks, Kathy Hochul will be the governor of New York." And that's how she discovered that she would be ascending to the spot of governor. And so her time in New York's highest office has been it's had its trials and tribulations. And I just want to acknowledge that. I also will acknowledge the fact that Governor Hochul has been far from a perfect governor. And that steps like this are the kind of things that I truly disagree with, that I understand that she is trying to respond to that right-wing criticism that she is too soft on crime, but effectively reinstating stop and frisk is not the way to go. We both know that minority communities will be disproportionately targeted within the state of New York for random checks. We know the fact that this will not actually reduce crime, it will just slow down the transit system. It will unfortunately likely lead to some unfortunate altercations, and it will lead to Black and brown New Yorkers being harassed at a disproportionately higher rate than their white counterparts. If you want to address subway crime in the state of New York, again, look at the root causes of why that subway crime exists. Look at the high homeless population that we've seen in the state of New York, and how our social services have failed to properly address that. How we failed to pass how we failed to pass housing policy that has addressed that crowd. Look at the fact that we have not built proper safety measures into our into our subways, where there's the giant open platforms that are super easy just to trip and fall into if you're not careful. There are actual steps that you could take to reduce crime within the city of New York. But as I said, reinstating what is effectively a version of stop and frisk is not going to keep anybody safe and is blatantly unconstitutional. I appreciate that the governor wants to reduce crime in the state of New York, but there are ways to do it that don't put our communities at risk, that actually do protect our communities, while also acknowledging the fact that, as I've said, and I will continue to say, that there are root causes to crime. No one. You're not. Listen, Mike. I don't know you very well, but I don't think you're going to wake up tomorrow and go, "Hey, I think I'm going to murder someone today." No one does that. There are underlying causes for why people commit crimes, and if we're only addressing the symptom and not the actual problem, we are never going to get anywhere in combating crime in New York or anywhere across the United States.
And on that same note, Mayor Eric Adams has advocated for increasing NYPD overtime funding to address subway safety concerns, but Hochul's decision to deploy the National Guard seemingly bypassed that request of the mayor. What implications does this rift between Hochul and Adams hold for the governance of New York City, and how might it impact their ability to effectively address the issue of crime?
Well, I will say this, that Mayor Adams loves to use the line of mayoral control within the city of New York. It's his favorite thing, and New York has a long history of the governor and the mayor of New York not getting along, where de Blasio and Cuomo famously absolutely despised each other. I will say that was a lot of political entertainment for those of us on the ground watching those two fight until the end there. But Mayor Adams has really shown a desire to try to maintain control of city governance at all costs, including at cost to its residents, where I actually had to help to run a campaign against the Adams administration when they tried to privatize retiree healthcare within the city, which would have made thousands of their former city employees lose access to their current medical plans, lose access to their current doctors, and reduce them to more expensive and worse healthcare plans. They've had to fight the people, those in the city, and I'm endorsed by the Council of School Supervisors and Administrators, which represents public school supervisors, public school superintendents, principals, those who run publicly funded daycare centers, have had to constantly fight to keep their funding in the budget. So I believe that the state of New York has to have a collaborative approach with the city of New York. I'm not suggesting that New York bulldoze in and say, Mayor Adams, you're out of here, and take full control of the city, because New York City has 9 million people, is larger than many states, is in its way its own entity, but there needs to be a collaborative approach to working with New York State. This cannot be a situation, there has to be balance here. This cannot be a situation where Mayor Adams is just trying to avoid New York State governance at all, but it also can't be a situation where the governor or the state legislature is just sending, like I said, people in to bulldoze over what the city has built. There needs to be collaboration. There needs to be a partnership there. On the criminal justice issue, I think that working with experts in New York City that understand how changes to the criminal justice system directly impact our communities is the only way to move forward. But using tax dollars to send the National Guard into the subways isn't keeping anyone safe. The NYPD has a budget larger than that of the military of some nations, and I'm not exaggerating about that. I believe that the NYPD budget is larger than Ukraine's defense budget. Deploying the National Guard into New York City is not a logical step. We can take other steps internally to make sure that we are addressing the root causes of crime, and that's something that I'm very dedicated to. The moment that I stepped into this race, the chair of the Suffolk GOP had a statement out being like, "Oh, Skyler Johnson's another soft on crime." Whatever he said, making up something in order to try to attack me, while not acknowledging that between me and my opponent, I'm the only one that's actually ever done anything to lower crime within the state of New York. And I think that if I'm elected, I can help to bring some of that collaborative approach to the city and help to make sure that we are expanding programs such as the Sheriff Start program that we've seen in Suffolk County into New York City, to make sure that we are addressing crime there as well.
A former NYPD sergeant has accused a top aide and influential confidant of New York City Mayor Eric Adams of sexual assault, alleging inappropriate touching and unwanted advances in a court complaint that was filed. Today, a woman who recently retired from the police department alleges that senior Adams advisor Tim Pearson regularly engaged in uncomfortable behavior and held inappropriate conversations with the accuser in 2022 and 2023. As someone deeply committed to advocating for marginalized communities and fostering social justice, how do you view the city's decision to fund Mayor Adams' defense against allegations of sexual assault, particularly given the serious nature of the accusations and the Me Too movement's emphasis on holding powerful figures like this accountable?
I don't spend as much time dealing with New York City's politics as I do with state politics, such as I said a minute ago. New York City does, in a large way, act as its own entity within the state of New York. They are often when you're reading bills that go into effect, there's an asterisk that says except for within the 5 boroughs of New York City, because they are often governed by their own rules. However, I do not believe that taxpayers should be funding the defense of sexual assault allegations. Everyone is entitled to a reasonable defense, but that reasonable defense is going to come at your own cost. And the mayor of New York City, who I can promise you is not barely scraping by, he has the money for a private defense, should not be receiving taxpayer funded defenses. It's remarkable that we've seen that come up as a possibility, as a possibility that government officials, if they're accused of poor personal conduct, are using taxpayer dollars in order to fund their defense. And I will always stand against that, because that is an absolutely unacceptable. That's an absolutely unacceptable expense. It is a frankly corrupt expense. So I'm sure that those around Mayor Adams would tell him the same thing, that him and his staff cannot be using taxpayer funded lawyers in order to fight sexual harassment or sexual assault allegations. They are entitled to a defense, and they should use privately hired attorneys in order to orchestrate that defense.
A lot of the issues that we've been talking about tonight have folks from different generations viewing them from different lenses, whether we're talking about the climate crisis, the need for comprehensive gun control, migrant crisis at the southern border, defense aid to our allies, Ukraine and Israel. There's a generational rift between those who came up in the Cold War era and are currently still serving in Congress, and those who are Gen Z folks like yourself. I would consider myself a hybrid between millennial and Gen Z. I came in '96. So depending on my experiences, fall on either side of the ledger. As someone deeply engaged in New York state politics, how do you see the dynamics between established political figures and emerging young leaders evolving in the near future?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of the most staunch support that I've received has been from that established generation. I mentioned that I think that I'm endorsed by New York State's Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, and when he was first elected, he was 18 years old. He was elected to a school board and was the youngest elected official within the state of New York at the time. He's slightly older than that now. I think I'll get an angry call from him if I start talking about his actual age online. But he was incredibly encouraging, because he understood the fact that containing power within one generation was not only impossible, it was impractical. He came out of the gate and endorsed me on day one, because he knew that our generations needed to work together in order to pass legislation, in order to legislate most effectively, and in order to build a New York that worked for everybody. Of course, I joke to Comptroller DiNapoli, and he hasn't denied it, that the only reason he supports me is to remind me that I will never be as young as he was when he was elected. But a lot of our senior elected officials have recognized the need for younger leadership, to bring the new generation into the fold. I just to tell you a quick story that I think you'll appreciate. When I ran for state senate in 2022, I was at a fundraiser with the rest of the Senate Democratic Conference, and we had a surprise visit from Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. And Senator Schumer had already endorsed me at that point, and I had seen him. I shook his hand. I was standing up in the front of the room with the rest of the Senate delegation, and Senator Schumer was giving a speech, and he looked at the crowd, and then he turned and he looked me in the eyes, and looked back to the crowd and said, "Well, I don't know if I want that one to win, because I was 24 when I was elected, and I was 23 when I was elected, and he'd only be 22. So he's going to beat my record, and I don't know how I feel about that." And the crowd laughed, and he said, "No, it's fine. I'm happy to give him my record." And that kind of humor is what he deployed, because he understood the fact that there was a new generation coming up that had that same hunger to help improve the world, just like their generation did a number of years back. And I have seen, thankfully, significant encouragement from members of the state legislature who have been there for years and who are ready to see a new generation work alongside them. I don't think this needs to be replace every person who's been in office for a long time here in New York. We have a lot of people who are highly experienced and highly effective lawmakers, but I do think that bringing in people like myself who have a different kind of experience, who grew up who are growing up within the technological age, to address these issues is going to be critical if we want to move forward properly. There has to be a partnership, and I am very thankful that I have seen voters recognize that, as well as those who are already in office.
New York, another development that has garnered attention is the fact that New York City finds itself at the center of a push to restrict transgender girls' athletic participation, bringing a national issue for cultural conservatives to the largest school district in the Democratic bastion of Manhattan. And the Community Education Council for one of the city's wealthiest school districts in Manhattan, including the Tony Upper East Side, voted to pass a resolution yesterday, Wednesday evening, urging Mayor Eric Adams' education officials to take up the matter. And the measure calls for the city to assemble a committee that would be charged with recommending changes to the Department of Education's 2019 gender guidelines. There used to be a saying, all politics is local. I would argue that in recent years, at least since Donald Trump came down that escalator, that added flipped on its head. You have a lot of national issues, things that would get folks whipped up in a frenzy in a suburban area like Fairfax, Virginia, all of a sudden finding its way in the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
So it's funny when I was in eighth grade, my first girlfriend really wanted to wrestle, and she was very, very interested in it, and there was no girls wrestling team, and so under Title X, the school had to allow her to wrestle on the boys team, and strangely enough, Moms for Liberty didn't show up outside the school with signs about gender segregation, and they didn't show up and start screaming about how she was at some sort of unfair advantage or disadvantage because of the body that she was born in. They didn't care. They only cared when the right needed a new boogeyman to divert from the fact that they are incapable of governing. And unfortunately, the transgender community has been the latest subject to this attack. So the one of my rules is that I don't actually engage in that debate, because there is no debate. It's fake. It's made up. It's completely made up. If transgender individuals, first of all, the allegation that a young man would decide to uproot their life, start undertaking hormone therapy, but potentially undergo surgery in order to gain a minimal advantage in sports is so ludicrous that it cannot be entertained. Because A, no one would ever do that. B, if they were doing that, why aren't we seeing that more often? If there actually was this rash or this epidemic of people either pretending to be transgender or actually being transgender and immediately stealing sports titles from cisgender girls, why isn't it happening? Why aren't we seeing constant stories about that? It is a completely fake debate being used to attack a marginalized community, and I will absolutely stand against that. And unfortunately, my opponent has made a comment in private that he opposes. New York is going to pass an equal rights amendment of our own this year to permanently protect against discrimination, which will, by the way, make that decision in Manhattan completely unconstitutional within the state of New York. But my opponent has said that he opposes that amendment because he doesn't want his daughter having to play sports with boys. So unfortunately, he's engaged in those same transphobic and entirely based out of reality attacks in order to try to get reelected based on fear. And that's all that this is. They're reelection tactics based on fear. Transgender individuals, there is no evidence of any of the claims that those who oppose transgender individuals in sports have made. There is no evidence of any safety concerns. There's no evidence that those who were assigned male at birth are actually receiving any significant kind of advantage if they are competing in women's sports competitions. It is remarkably disturbing to see anyone caving to this political pressure, because it is just a reinvention of gay panic. It's a reinvention of every generation has to have their boogeyman, and the far right has chosen transgender individuals at this time. Just like they were claiming that gay kids shouldn't be allowed in the same bathrooms or locker rooms in the 90s, they are now claiming that transgender individuals are the next massive danger to society. We are going to continue to see we are going to continue to see this cycle of finding a new boogeyman, finding someone new to point at. And unfortunately, children who are trying to grapple with personal identity, with their own personal identity, are being thrown into the crossfire. Transgender individuals are already at a high rate of, or a significantly higher risk for suicide. And now having our leaders on the news constantly espousing how they are lying about this to gain, again, a minimal advantage in sports competitions is remarkably disgusting. And I won't, and I'm sorry to go on about this issue, but it is incredibly angering because and unfortunately, many on the alt-right have really given up the game here, because we've seen transgender individuals compete in things like chess or croquet competitions, and somehow people who are against transgender individuals claim that they are somehow at a biological advantage because they were assigned male at birth. I wasn't aware that a chess or hula hooping competition somehow was better suited for those who were born male than someone who wasn't. It's remarkable what I've been discovering from all of these scientists. So I will absolutely do everything I can to support trans rights, and I will always oppose these fake and incredibly unethical attacks on transgender individuals, because they are not based in reality. They are solely based in Republican elected officials knowing that if they don't distract from their lack of political record, their lack of legislative record, that they will not be able to get reelected.
And these same Republican officials during the Obama administration, I'm old enough to remember back when I was in college, were going onto the airwaves saying, I'm not a scientist when it came down to climate change proposals.
Right.
But are we witnessing a generational shift in political power and influence? And I ask that in light of the fact that while we do have Maxwell Frost, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, we have you, Skyler Johnson, we have folks on the progressive side running for and taking seats in state houses and the national legislature. We also have Matt Gaetz. We also have folks like George Santos. We have Marjorie Taylor Greene. These are young folks too. Are we witnessing a generational shift in political power and influence? And if so, what implications does this have for the future of governance and policy making?
Well, I do not claim Marjorie Taylor Greene in any way, shape, or form. Any other generation can have her. We don't want her. But I do think that we are seeing that shift. Yes, and I think that the evidence that we are seeing that shift is how much the Republican establishment is terrified of that shift. Because you saw, someone who is a pretty young guy, Vivek Ramaswamy, running for president. And one of the first things he did was say we should raise the voting age to try to prevent young people from voting. And we have seen that echoed by Republican elected officials around the country who are absolutely terrified of the idea of young people voting. At the end of the day, a lot of Republicans, unfortunately, are terrified of their constituents actually having a voice. In fact, actually, my Congressman Nick LaLota, who replaced Lee Zeldin in the House of Representatives, is the former Republican Commissioner of Elections and removed early voting places from Democratic areas of Suffolk County when he was in that position, because he knew what would happen if Democrats had easier access to voting places. And I believe that is really the case with young people as well. Young people are overwhelmingly liberal. They're overwhelmingly pro trans rights. They're overwhelmingly pro social justice reforms. They are overwhelmingly supportive of the initiatives that stand against everything that the MAGA crowd is for. And I believe that in the next few years, we're going to see more and more efforts to suppress the young vote by any means necessary. And I believe that is the exact evidence that we need, that young people are a massive threat to that, to MAGA Republicans. We are now seeing the trickle of young people getting elected across the country. There's been many that have been elected into their local state legislatures. There's many more that are coming up. I was hanging out with Joe Vogel, who's a member of the Maryland House of Delegates, who's running for Congress down there the other day, and I see leaders like him. I see leaders across Suffolk County that are going to make the difference. I think that we have a real possibility to bring more young people into governance, to bring more young people into politics. But as I said at the beginning of this, there needs to be an effort to foster that kind of leadership and to recognize how difficult it is to step into a world of politics when you're young. But yes, young people have the ability to make a significant and a very noticeable impact on politics here. We won't do it alone. Like I said, this needs to be this can't be a generational replacement. This can't be one generation attempting to conquer another. This has to be a partnership at the end of the day. And I believe that young people have what it takes to create that partnership, to bring their experiences into line with those who are already in positions of power, and to work together in order to bridge that gap. Because once they do, we will really have the ability to understand how legislation is affecting those at every aspect of at every stage of life, and work and build better policy accordingly. So yes, we're seeing a change, and I'm hoping to be part of that change.
You mentioned Ramaswamy. I recall one of the lines in President Biden's State of the Union address, and I think it was effective because there's been so much on age. A lot of folks complaining and griping and wringing their hands about the fact that Biden's old, and then they're saying, well, they're both old. These are the two oldest men to run for the office, and there's so much emphasis on age. And I've always said, when people go in the voting booths, nobody's voting on age. We talk about it on cable news shows, we talk about it on the internet, we talk about it privately with our friends and our family. But when push comes to shove, when we get in that voting booth, folks are voting for reproductive rights, folks are voting for climate, folks are voting for their tax policies that they want to see implemented. Folks are voting to keep health care, the Affordable Care Act, existing. People are voting for Social Security. Those are the things that motivate people to the polls. President Biden said in the State of the Union address, I may not be a young person, right? He alludes to the fact that he was at one time too young. People kept saying he was too young to be a legislator, a senator. Now he's being criticized for being too old. But he said, my ideas are younger than my opponents, my predecessors, as he referred to him constantly throughout the night. And he hit home with that message in an ad that the DNC released shortly afterwards, where he says, look, I'm not a young guy, but look at what I'm fighting for. These are the ideas that are younger than my opponent's ideas. The idea that you should have autonomy over your own body. The idea that we should not be shackled by student loan debt. The idea that, you go down the list, that we should be able to tackle the climate crisis, that we shouldn't have to wait for it to get out of hand for us to wake up and realize there's a problem. I thought that was such a resonating message in a climate where people are just griping about age so much. What are your thoughts about that? In light of the fact that Senator Bernie Sanders recently called for a 4-day work week. Now, of course, President Biden has not endorsed that. But I remember when President Biden got in office and a reporter asked Bernie Sanders, are you surprised with the progressive rate in which the president's going? And he kind of smiled and said, yeah, I am pretty surprised. What do you think?
So I like that. I like that message. Of course, Donald Trump is a whole 3 years younger than Joe Biden. But unfortunately, as Joe Biden has pointed out, Donald Trump may be 3 years younger, but he lives in the year 1920. It's very clear that we only have one person running for president who's actually attempting to move the clock forward. And I believe that up and down the ticket, we need to be looking for those candidates. This can't just be about Joe Biden and Donald Trump. We need to be looking at the candidates beyond factors like age, who are actually looking to bring into place reforms that are going to benefit working people, who are going to make sure that they are supporting union ideals, who are going to be making sure that they are not just caving to a small percentage of voters who can fund their campaigns. Age matters to some extent. It's good to see, as I've said many times, some generational diversity here, but it can't be the main deciding factor. And I think, as you said, most people agree. Most people agree on that. There'll be a lot of bickering about it, but I believe that when push comes to shove, people will vote based on their ideals. And I think that that's really what's necessary. As we are moving towards November, it has to be very clear that we have a party trying to regain power in DC and in New York and in every other state that just saw one of their courts tried to attempt to ban IVF procedures because they said that embryos were protected humans under God's divine law. That we are seeing a party that is trying to dismantle the systems, that is trying to dismantle the establishment clause of the Constitution that protects from the infringement of on and from religious liberties. We are seeing a party that is attempting to dismantle our Constitution piece by piece until the sections of the Second Amendment that they like is the only thing left. We are seeing a party that has very openly advertised that should they retake power this year, that they are going to try to remove everyone who's experienced from Washington, D.C. and replace them from party loyalists who they think will undo all of the checks and balances put into place by our Constitution. So I believe that as we are voting, we have to make sure that we are acknowledging that only those who, as you said, are not trying to turn back the clock, but to keep it ticking, are the ones who need to get reelected, are the ones who need to get elected for the first time. I'll be 24 before the election. I may be young, but I don't think that that's actually the thing that's important. That's really important here. What's important here is that I care about what happens to democracy in this country. I care about what happens to public education. I care about people being able to afford the cost of living, and my Republican opponent does not in the slightest and will openly admit that to you. So with that in mind, I think it is very important that we are voting for people, as you said, who have young ideals, not just who are young of age, because it is incredibly important that we are looking at who's going to move the country forward, and to make sure that when I come back on here in 40 years and that we have this conversation again one day, that our kids and our grandkids actually have a future to come to, that they have not been driven out in economic exile, that they have not seen the ravages of climate change. But if we don't take the steps, we are not going to build that future at all. So I completely agree with you, and I'm looking forward to helping to build that future that is sustainable economically, environmentally, and for everyone, not just a wealthy few.
Well, Skyler Johnson, we've been fantastic. Thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. Learned a lot from you tonight. Now, for those who want to donate to your campaign, want to get involved, want to be able to support you, where can they go?
So if they go to my website, which is just skylerforny.com, SKYLERFORNY.com, there's information on how to donate, on how to volunteer, on how to join my email list. And I really hope you will join me, because, and I'll leave you with this. My district is encompassed, my district, as I've alluded to, is in the middle of a key congressional district. So if you help me, you're also going to help us drive out votes to flip Congressional District 1 and to help to retake control of the House of Representatives. And I'm looking forward to working with everyone to make sure that we are building the future that we've talked about on this podcast so far.
Awesome. With that being said, that's going to conclude episode 128 of the Political Mike podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Skyler.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mike podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePollyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.